Welcome to Enemy Setup. We're going to start by creating a brand new, just blank enemy container. So let's right click, do a 3D object. We'll do a cube, and we can go ahead and reset our transforms. Press W and bring it on over. And we'll go ahead and grab our material for this and just put a red on it of some sort. There we go. Haha. Anyway, so we'll go ahead and name this enemy still. We're going to go to our scripts folder and let's create a new script here. And we're going to name this enemy controller. No spaces, capital E, capital C. And then we can open that up. And we also want to open our dash script because we're going to make this where we dash and can damage the enemy, but we also want the enemy to be able to damage the player if we're not dashing. So we're just going to go ahead and get that set up, just the start, and a few changes for that. So with our dash, right, we have our move script, we have our dash speed variable, we have our dash duration. We're going to change this to be our cooldown duration. And we'll just make this 1F for right now. We are also going to have a particle system trailing our player whenever we're dashing, so we can go ahead and add that in. Particle system, we'll name it dash trail, and then we're also going to have, we need to control if we're able to dash or not, and so we're going to use a boolean for that, and we'll just call this is dashable. And we'll set this to true. And then we will also add another variable for controlling if we can damage the enemy. We'll call this one is dash damage on. And although this is a variable, we want to create a property for our enemy to be able to look at and see. For this one, we're going to make this a public property. Bool. It's a boolean, and it'll be a capital I because it's a property. So is dash damage on. And so this property, when the enemy looks at this property, we want it to be able to get the boolean, whether it's true or false. This for this variable is dash damage on. So we're going to use the get method for this property. And that get method, inside of the get method, we then have to put our curly braces. And inside here, we're getting the is dash damage variable, but we're returning, so we can just write return is dash damage on, and then put a semicolon. So when our enemy gets this property, it will return the is dash damage on boolean, which will be true or false. So it's essentially going to return true or false. And then for right now, we'll also go ahead and get a public integer for dash damage is equal to 10. And now, for when we start the game, we want to say is dashable to be true. And we want our is dash damage on variable to be false. That is, we can dash, but we're not damaging any enemies because we're not dashing yet, right? Then in our update, we want to change a few things here. Number one, our get mouse button. We're going to change this to get mouse button down. And you could go to the Unity help or just Google it, Unity get mouse button down, and check the documentation and the differences to that. And instead of starting this coroutine, we're going to delete that. And we're first going to say, so we want to look and see, okay, if you press the mouse button, and then we also want to know if dashable is true. This means is dashable true. So then if dashable is true, we're going to execute this dash instructions, but we're just going to make this a regular method because we don't really need a coroutine at this point in time. I had planned out something else, but we're going to do this a little bit more efficient. So now what we can do is we'll just simply in here do dash and put our parentheses and then our semicolon. Then we could also create a method here just so you know how to stop and play a particle system. So here we could create a method for void, and we'll call this create dash fx. Make sure you pay attention to the capitalization. And in this method, we just get our particle system that was up at the top, the dash trail. Now, when we attach the particle system to the player, it's going to play automatically. But if it wasn't playing, we can use the dot play method for the particle system, and it would play it. Just like you can also use the dot stop as well, which will stop it from playing. So we could essentially create another method called stop dash effects and use the dash trail dot stop to stop that. And then in that case, we would want, if we dash, we would want to create the trail effects, in which we could place in here and activate that. So for now, I may just comment that out, because we may want to put that somewhere else, but that's just how you do that, just so you know. So now for the dashing. So instead of this kind of timer that we've got going on here, we're going to get rid of that. And the first thing we want to do is, if we're dashing, we're going to say is dash damage on. This is the regular variable. We're going to set that to true. So is dash damage on is true, so that we can damage the enemy. And then we're going to select this line of code and do Control X and paste it, Control V underneath that. And we don't need the rest of this, so we can delete that. Now, this line of code actually makes our player dash. So as soon as we have dashed, then we're going to say is dashable is now false. So that way we can't dash again right away. But what we want to do is call a method and wait before executing it. So the method that we're going to write here, we're just going to simply say void and start cooldown. Now for our start cooldown, this is where we're going to say, hey, when you run start cooldown, we're going to set our variable as dash damage on to false, because we're no longer dashing. We don't want to damage any enemies because we're not dashing. And then we want is dashable back to true, so that we can click the mouse button again and be able to dash. And then if we wanted to debug this to check for any errors, we could also put something in here like cooldown ran is dashable ready. We could do that a few other places as well for checking our code, but let's go back up here. So after we dash, we want to start this cooldown. So what we're going to do is just use this method called invoke, and invokes the method name in time of seconds. So what we'll do is invoke, and then in parentheses we need the method name and the time that we want to wait. So it kind of delays it for us. So the method name is start cooldown. Make sure capitalization is exactly the same. And then we can put a comma and do cooldown duration, right? So this will, and semicolon, this will wait 1 second and then run the start cooldown method, which will put our dash damage to false and is dashable to true, so we can dash again. Because if you remember, our update is looking to see if we've selected the mouse button and if is dashable is true. So we could delete this space here. So we've got this all nice and cleaned up, and save that. Now back in our game, we'll select our player. And if we do not assign a dash trail, it will give us an error. So I've already created a trail particle system. We'll go over that soon in a future video, but right now what you could simply do is just create a effect particle system like this, and then in your player just drag and drop that into the dash trail, so that way that will play when you're dashing. For me, I'm going to use the trails for right now, and we'll have a video on that later. So I also went ahead and set, so I've got a dash speed, I've got my cooldown duration. I shortened it to 0.5 actually, so that way it won't wait as long. And then put our dash damage to 50 for playtesting, because when we go to damage the enemy, we want to see quickly and test out the enemy being destroyed if the enemy has 100 health. So that's a quick setup for the player. So we'll save this and save our scripts. We can save all of them. Now we want to go to our enemy controller script. So I'm just going to get rid of all of these and start from scratch. So the first thing that we need is we're going to serialize this, and we'll do, we want to be able to damage the player. So what is the damage amount? Whoops, lowercase d. And we're also, copy this, we also want to have our enemy health. So we can set up how much health do we want our enemies to have. Then we'll serialize field. Again, this time we want a game object, because it'll probably be a particle system, but we'll just leave it game object. That could be beneficial. And we're going to name this one hit FX prefab. So what particle system are we going to use for the hit effects? We could put a little note out here. Need to assign. And we'll do the same thing again, but this time instead of hit effects, when the enemy gets hit several times and we want them to be destroyed, we're going to play an explode. We could do explode FX or just explode prefab, but it is an FX. Okay, so now that we got our variables, we need to call those. So we're going to first set up our on collision enter. And this is if player collides with our enemy. So we got a couple things that we got to do here. Number one is we need to get the player controller script. We're going to just name it as player. So how do we get this? Well, we look at the collision, the game object that collided with the enemy, and we're going to run the get component method. And what component do we want to get? The player controller, and this is the get component method, right? So it ends with the parentheses and then our semicolon. Now we're going to do the same thing for the dash third person. We'll just call this dash. And almost the same thing, except for the get component is the dash third person script. Then after that, we want to look and see. We want to make sure that the player has the player controller script on it and that it's not just missing. So kind of quick way of doing that is just now using that variable and saying, hey, is the player not equal to nothing? Now that's just one condition. We also want a second condition. We also want to check the dash script on the player, and we want to say, hey, let's get that property is dash damage on, or is it false? So in this case, we're just looking to see if it's false. So if dash is not on and the player collides with the enemy, well, we want to damage the player, so we can go player dot use that change health script. And what are we doing in the parentheses? We're minusing from the player's health the damage amount. Pretty simple. Then, now that's just for colliding with the enemy. We're also going to go ahead and set up the void on trigger. Even though this won't be fully functional yet, we're going to go ahead and set this up as well. So again, we want to get, if we're triggered, we want to get the dash script. And if you wanted to check this, we could easily do a debug.log and do something like triggered by enemy, something like that. And then we're going to have, that would let you know that it is running the on trigger enter, right? Ooh, and we need to change this to other.gameObject get component dash script. So if we have the trigger on the collider, so we got a trigger area and the player enters it, we want to make sure that the dash is not equal to nothing. So is the dash there? Does it exist? And then we want a second condition, so it has to meet both conditions. So there has to be the dash third person script on the player, and then we also want to make sure that the dash dot is damage on is true. And we don't have to write anything here because this literally should confirm that it's true, because it's just going to check that property is dash damage on. We could also even just put is it equal to true. That would kind of be the same thing. Then if we wanted to make sure this ran, we could do a debug.log and say is dash damage is on, baby. Yeah, it's working. And then if it's not, ooh. And then so if is dash damage is on, player has the script on it. So if the player dashes through the trigger area of the enemy, we want it to damage the enemy. So in this case, we'll just say enemy health minus equals. So we're taking the enemy health, we're going to minus the dash damage, and that'll be the new enemy's health. So we minus equals, get our dash script dot dash damage, whatever the dash damage amount is. Which could be something that we're able to level up in the game and we're able to do more damage. And if we wanted to check this, we could do a debug.log and enemy received damage. Ouch. Just because. There we go. So, now, player dashes through the triggered area of the enemy. It changes the enemy's health, so the enemy loses health. Now, the enemy's is still alive, so what we want to do is we're going to create a game object called hit fx. See, what do we name it up here? Hit fx prefab. We'll just call it hit fx. And this is going to be, instantiate. And we're instantiating the hit fx, hit fx prefab. And we're using the transform.position and the transform.rotation. And that will spawn in our hit effects particle system. And if we wanted to make sure that that line was working, again, we could do a debug if you're testing anything or you need to check that. Now, when you have another case in this case, so if we want to look and see and check the enemy's health, and if the enemy's health is less than or equal to 0, so if the enemy's at like negative 1.5 or negative 50, it doesn't matter. If it's anything less than 0, we want to destroy the enemy game object, which is just whatever has this script on it. And then we may want to delay that, maybe. So what we can do is just put a comma and put 0.5f, so it'll delay it by half a second. And we could, if we didn't have the particle system, we could do a debug.log. Debug. Just put something in there real quick and end it. There we go. Now we also want to instantiate the explode prefab. Again, at the transform.position and the rotation. Same stuff again. But what we want to do is assign this. We can assign this as a game object. We'll call it explode fx. We could do capitals. There we go. So this will create a new game object that will have the particle system and all that on it. There we go. All right, so we'll save this now. And then we want to go to our enemy here and put on our enemy controller script. I've got an error. I had this little winking smiley face here. So just delete that. It's not supposed to be there. Whoopsie. And then now back in here. Now our enemy controller pulls up. So we'll set our damage amount to say 10. Our enemy health to say 100. Now we do need to have some kind of particle system for right now. So what I can do is just go to my prefabs and I could just use the sparkles that I created already for right now. But I would want to create new particle systems for the hit effects and the explode effects and replace that eventually. So we'll save this and make sure we have our box collider, and we just want a regular box collider on it. Let's turn my gizmos on. Okay, so we're just playtesting to see will this damage the player, and nope, it's not working. So we're gonna have to take a look at this. We've got an error for the start cooldown. We've got some kind of issue here. And I just remembered what it was. So, if we look at our enemy, and we are using the on trigger enter, which works with colliders and Rigidbody. So on our player, we're going to need to have a sphere collider for this. And so what we can do, I'm just going to move this player. You don't have to move your player over. I'm just going to show you. But you can kind of see my player's going to kind of get about this close and bump it with the character controller. So for our sphere collider, I want to turn that on. If you don't have one, just go to add component, type in sphere, add in a sphere collider, okay? So we're going to add in the sphere collider. And what we're going to do is make this a radius of 0.7. That looks pretty good. So that will collide nice and easily with the enemy. So we want that. That'll detect, or the enemy will detect the player with that really easily, okay? And also, just in case, I went ahead and tagged my player. If you don't have that player tag, go ahead and create that tag as well for that. And the next thing that we're going to do is add a Rigidbody component. Now, when we add our Rigidbody, there's going to be a couple weird things. Number one is we've got these eyewear on the character that's a sub-object, right? This child object that's going to get kind of wonky. So on our Rigidbody, we have these constraints. And so our constraints, we could just freeze rotation for right now because our ball is not actually rotating. So we'll just freeze those for right now. And I think we should be able to just turn off use gravity because our player controller already should be identifying gravity. So then we can click play. And we should see, yep, see we get the green there. Boom. 50, 40, 30. So it's working good with damaging the player. So for our enemy real quick, our enemies will go into the tag area. I think I did this already but didn't put it in the video, but you'll want to go to add tag and here click the plus button and then you'll type in whatever the enemy tag and you'll add that in. So I did a capital E and I went ahead and tagged both of my little enemies here as enemy. Just in case for later, we could use that and actually get the tag of the objects, right, to confirm. But that's a good start for part 1 of the enemy. I am really looking forward to doing the dash trail particle system and showing you also how to set up the UI for the enemy health as well.